Good day and welcome. My name is Nadia McConnell. I'm president of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. We welcome you to this very important discussion. I really want to thank our participants for so quickly coming together and agreeing to have this discussion. For those of us who lived through the catastrophe of the Chernobyl accident, find eerie, dangerous, I think, parallels to what we experienced. And that, I mean, from those of us who were here in Washington, the US, and other capitals of the West, trying to help respond appropriately to the Chernobyl accident. Let me just run through what happened. April 26th is the Chernobyl accident takes place. I think the next day, a Swedish scientist noted radiation clouds and determined it was coming from the Soviet Union, and were contacting, and of course there was denial that anything was going on, and that went on for days. May 1st, we know from Sherbetsky's granddaughter, Sherbetsky was head of the Communist Party in Ukraine, that Sherbetsky asked Gorbachev to cancel the May Day parade. Gorbachev said, no, if you cancel the parade, put your party card on the table, meaning that's the end of your career. So on May 1st, down the main streets of Kyiv Chrestatik, there were children carrying flower bouquets, banners, gaily parading down the streets while radiation was falling on their heads. As they went past the reviewing stand, they noticed that a lot of the party leaders were not there. They had evacuated, not only themselves, their family, but their pets. And also during this period, there was a bicycle race to promote good health. It was 2 weeks before Gorbachev acknowledged that there was a serious problem to deal with. He refused, Mr. Glasnost refused all assistance to come through. The International Red Cross was trying. No, and we knew that every week from Chicago, there were planes going to Warsaw with dry powdered milk and various medications to help mitigate the radiation impact. We even, those of us here in Washington, even appealed to Armand Hammer, who was a very close personal friend of Gorbachev. Armand Hammer's father actually was the president who established the Communist Party in the United States. And so both he and his father had close relationships with many of the top Soviet leaders. We appealed to him on a humanitarian basis to see if we could be sending some assistance. Armand Hammer sent Dr. Robert Gale from California to Moscow to assess the situation. He reported that everything was under control. Now that would be like going to Cleveland to assess what was happening after 9/11 in New York. And so again, there was no ability to provide any assistance. It was only 3 years after the accident, and we've got Alex Kuzma here with us, who was instrumental in the relief effort for children of Chernobyl, that we were able to send any kind of assistance. Assistance delayed is assistance denied. Why do I see parallels, or some of us have been talking, to what's going on with the Kakhovka Dam situation? One is the fact that we are allowing the Kremlin to avoid full responsibility for the catastrophe. We are falling into this trap of, well, maybe it was the Ukrainians who did it. Maybe, I mean, it's beyond. I have no words, at least not any I could use in public to describe that attitude. Also, in terms of assistance. Yes, the international organizations are there, but they are woefully not doing the job that needs to be done. The impact of Kakhovka, just like Chernobyl, went way beyond the borders of Ukraine. And the same thing is true with Kakhovka. We hope to have a series of webinars who dive deeper into different aspects of this catastrophe. But one is about all of the contaminated waters that are flowing into the Black Sea. So all the countries around the Black Sea are going to be impacted. We have been since the beginning of the War of 14, and of course, when the full invasion took place last year, sending humanitarian aid of different kinds, and we have had to increase those efforts. But there are new elements to the need, and that has to do with infectious diseases. When I hear things like Ebola and cholera, it's really rather frightening. And yet, I don't see any attention or discussion of any of these catastrophic results of the blowing up of the dam. The media is strangely, I would say, quiet. I watched this morning, and it's mostly about the submersible. It's everything. And the thing about Ukraine now is focused on the counteroffensive. Little, if anything, is being reported about what is taking place regarding the humanitarian needed response, the fact that the Russians are blocking assistance, only those with Russian passports are being allowed to evacuate. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I am troubled that just like with Chernobyl, the world did not press for information about what was going on, and also press to assist the people of Ukraine in great need. So I am very grateful that my colleagues we have worked through many of these informational propaganda wars here in the West, are joining us. And of course, Dr. Yuri Kostenko that I met in '91, who could talk about not only Chernobyl, but of course, what is going on today, and our other guests. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, who's been, like say, my partner in a lot of these battles, Irene Jarosewich. Irene Jarosewich is currently public affairs representative from the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations to the UN Civil Society Unit, formerly also editor-in-chief of Svoboda, senior editor for the Ukrainian Weekly, and perhaps one of the more significant was when she went in '90 to be the liaison for Rukh with the foreign press. So, Irena, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And also, I thank everybody else for agreeing to join us. Thank you. Irena, I turn it.
Okay. Дякую, Надю. It is true. We are warriors and will continue to be till the last day. Again, welcome to all. My name is Irene Jarosewich, or in English, Irene Jarosewich. I will be today's moderator for the webinar Lessons Ignored. Immediately after the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres referred to the event as a monumental humanitarian, economic, ecological catastrophe with worldwide implications. Recently, an analyst from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., called it one of the biggest human-caused disasters of our time, comparing it to the human-caused disaster of Chernobyl that also resulted in profound pollution, immediate and enduring threats to public health, unusable agricultural lands, severely degraded ecology, unstable economic environment that will affect not only Ukraine, but other countries for decades. The Kakhovka Dam destruction and its consequence will, like Chernobyl, not end anytime soon. The overall event seems to have received, as Nadia noted, very little of the world's attention. And that is a situation we hope to remedy a bit today by making a dent. All the issues associated with the destruction of this dam can not possibly be covered in one webinar. But let us begin today with our guests. Again, I do also want to say it is being recorded and it will be available for viewing. Dr. Yuri Kostenko is the former Minister of Environmental Protection of Ukraine, a former member of Parliament, Ukraine's parliament. And last year, Mr. Kostenko published an extensive commentary warning about the dangers of Russian occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Today, we hope he will address some of the deep concerns regarding the nuclear power plant, which is located on the right bank of the Dnipro, slightly upriver from where the dam burst. Concerns include accidents, false flag terrorist operations, frankly, just incompetence, and the increased dangers to the plant itself, given the destruction of the dam. Doctors Tim Flanagan and Andrii Mamotenko are both infectious disease experts. Together, they have agreed to speak on the immediate and long-term health consequences of the disaster, implications of the destruction of the medical infrastructure, destruction of the water and delivery and purification systems, and the types of health management strategies and solutions that could be and should be considered. Alice Kuzma is currently the Vice President of Development for the Ukrainian Catholic University Foundations, but he's had more than 2 decades of experience delivering medical aid to victims of Chernobyl in the 1990s and early 2000s. He will address the potential challenges of delivering, monitoring, sustaining such aid, as well as offer insights that he's learned from the Chernobyl experience that may also apply to Kakhovka. So let us begin. Then let's wait for Pan Yuri. We're going to move on. Dr. Flanagan and Dr. Mamotenko, are you ready to begin? I hope, yes, unmute yourselves. Thank you. Good morning to you both.
Good morning. Yeah, otherwise. Okay, so main problems of the region of Kherson Oblast, Dnipropetrovsk region, and Zaporizhzhia region, which was involved in this problem after the most affected regions of this blowing of this dam in Kakhovka, will be the things that was related to clear and pure water that people need to use in their lives, because the most places where people was taking the clear water was under the ground of the most people's houses, and these people will be not able to get this clear water for years from there, and especially for now, they will not have any logistics and any resources and places where to get this clear and clear water to drink and to use during their normal life. And this is probably will be the most problem for the next months. Yes, 1 or 2 or 3 months after this. Second, I think one of the most problems is the getting all this septics, cemeteries, all these places with pollutions. Yes, and this with this pollution that was blown up to the Black Sea, and they can affect Odessa coast is only 100 kilometers from the Kherson River when it's going to the Black Sea. So first of all, will be affected these places like Odessa region, Ukraine, but not only Odessa, also Crimea coast, west coast of Crimea will be affected very much because of this all this water that's going up from Dnipro River, Bulgaria, maybe all the Black Sea, all the area of Black Seas that close to the Dnipro River will be affected by all this contagious water and all this pollution that will go through it. So this problem will take years to solve, you know, like not only one, I think like 5, maybe 10 years we will get troubles because of this thing that Russian government did. They just decided to blow it up. It was like they were thinking that they was planning it, and they did it. So we will have these problems for the next few years, and people can be affected by infection diseases because of this lack of clear water, and because of contaminating of all of this. Because after the dam was just blown, the level of the water get high, and then in 2 weeks, and also now it went down, but all of the surfaces, all of the houses, all around in what was down on this dam was contaminated with everything possible that can be there. So it's a huge problem.
Yeah, I think this is really, as you stated, a public health catastrophe. And people immediately think about clean water, and that's exactly right. I mean, there are trucks that were trying to bring in clear water from surrounding countries, even from Austria. But the sanitation issues can't be underestimated. What they call the coliform counts, that means the E. coli and other bacteria from dead animals that spill over from sewage systems that are totally overrun. As those coliform counts go up, we see rates of diarrhea and chronic illness get worse. So the elderly that have chronic lung disease or chronic liver disease or chronic kidney disease are heavily impacted. The very young will develop diarrhea. So the general health will significantly be impacted in this whole region, which is really horrendous. So you have clean water, you have sanitation, and then you have destruction of the healthcare infrastructure. If you don't have clean water, you cannot run your clinics. Think of what it means not to have clean water and provide general health care. Delivering a baby, for example, stitching up a wound for a soldier, trying to take care of those that are malnourished. The problems are immense, and will be the downstream impact on health will be extraordinary. So I know the UN and WHO have cited the concern of cholera. Very, very good point. But cholera is just a marker. It's a marker that you don't have clean water and that you have sanitation collapse. And that doesn't just mean your own sanitation, it's from our environmental contamination. And it's all the animals that die. How the water supply gets affected is really extraordinary. And that downstream then literally will close clinics and hospitals. And then you won't be able to provide standard health care. So even like we saw in other catastrophes, sometimes the morbidity and mortality from the collapse of the healthcare system is even greater than the direct amount of morbidity and mortality from infectious diseases from unclean water. But this all will come together. So I think the scope of this is as massive as you've been describing. It is a public health and a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, you read about the amount of water there. This was an inland sea backed up behind the dam. It wasn't just a standard hydroelectric power plant. And it's obviously clear the only way it could have been blown up was internally, not externally. And that could have only been done by the Russians who were occupying the dam.
I know we were going to put questions at the end, but I'm going to just interrupt one quick second. For our listeners in the United States, I think it's important to maybe compare Dnipro River runs through the center of the country the way the Mississippi runs through the center of America. And you, Dr. Flanagan, you and I had a brief discussion. Can you sort of give some comparisons in terms of size or what would have happened on the Mississippi or in Lake Mead, something that is familiar to us, to give us a comparative understanding of the impact of that catastrophe in Ukraine, so that we get a sense of what happened there if it had happened the equivalent in the United States?
So I think we imagine, and from the media reports, you see the water flowing out and you imagine all the areas that are flooded. And obviously those people need to be rescued and those villages evacuated. But the entire water supply for the region, the entire irrigation for all the fields were being fed by this extraordinarily rich water supply that was really an inland sea in terms of its size. So that means that a whole region depends on it. It's almost as if you dealt with the agricultural belt in California, which is totally dependent on these massive water supplies of Colorado, Lake Mead, and all that area. We're kind of familiar with those struggles now. But the destruction of that dam, which generated an enormous amount of electricity, and then was the life source for a whole series of canals, which fed water, irrigation, and support through the whole region, critically important. So this does not affect just folks downstream. This is a whole regional development, which is catastrophic.
Thank you. Let's see if Dr. Yuri Kostenko can join us now. We'll go back to Drs. Mamotenko and Flanagan, but let's try to get Pan Yuri on if he has a connection while we have him.
Thank you for inviting me. The theme we are discussing right now, from my perspective, first of all, it has to be discussed not in the context of the bad consequences that may impact Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant due to the damage to the cooling system there, but we need to talk about the political aspects. There's a special parliamentary committee that we established in 1990 to study the causes and consequences of Chernobyl accident. And I remember the main conclusion of the scholars who were persuading us at the time that under no circumstances, no technical or technological circumstances, Chernobyl, the type of reactor that Chernobyl has, that it is one of the most safe, it's one of the safest in the world. It cannot possibly cause a catastrophe of a big scale. Locally, maybe, but not a big scale. And the explosion that took place in 1986, it's fully discarded all those claims of the builders of Chernobyl type reactors, all the scientists. So the consequences of that explosion could be seen by the whole world. Number two, what I would like to remind everyone on this subject, speaking of threats to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, when new types of reactors were being developed, like M1000, they took into account even such factors, such possibility as if an airplane crashes into the protective layer, and that was supposed to be solid enough. But what happened in Fukushima after the tsunami totally crosses out all those expectations that had been made while they were designing that power plant. The outcomes of that nuclear power plant accident were also very bad. So I want to go back to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The threats of Russian military aggression for today's world are totally new. They were not known before. According to international law, Russia's action on Ukraine's atomic nuclear power plants like Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, this is called international nuclear terrorism, according to international law. And other countries need to respond adequately to nuclear terrorism. But unfortunately, neither the International Nuclear Agency director nor the United Nations have ever raised this question in the context of charging Russia, accusing Russia of nuclear terrorism, and they have not framed any possible international sanctions in order to terminate such criminal activity on behalf of Russia. Next, I want to bring up what may or could happen at Zaporizhzhia power plant, nuclear power plant. People mostly talk about technical aspects of that, possible accidents such as problems with water supply, but for now they still have the cooling pond near the power plant, so the problem does not look scary. However, none of the experts, including those on behalf of the International Nuclear Agency, are not mentioning very obvious things. They think that there are armed troops of the Russian Federation within the perimeter of this station, of the power plant. The fact that they are planting explosives at that power plant, they are delivering other dangerous items such as artillery ammo and mortar ammo. So from the standpoint of rules of safe use of nuclear energy, even if one person comes to inside the perimeter that does not have security clearance, that's a big problem. But if so many people come there with weapons and bringing other military supplies, and those military of Russia are not under control of anybody, and the world for some reason is not worried about that. So what scenarios could evolve if one of those who speak about a reliability of water supply for Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the availability of alternative water sources like artesian water wells and the availability of hydrogen absorption that may be activated if water supply is disrupted. All those are technical aspects, but no one is saying what scale of Russian criminal activity may happen with those systems at the nuclear power plant. In other words, what Russians could explode, blow up at that nuclear power plant. And they just talk about the cooling pond, but they don't talk about the system of running water itself, which can easily be destroyed, ruined. And so then the cooling for the nuclear equipment and for the storage of used nuclear fuel, that is not being discussed. But after they exploded, they blew up the dam of Kakhovka power plant. Those scenarios become very obvious. And first of all, it's Putin who now, as the result of Ukraine's offensive, which he is incapable of stopping, that most of all can lead us to implementation of those mad scenarios of Russia with explosions at nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia that include, so that would be ruining of the destruction of the cooling systems, and then things may go out of control. And the worst thing that can happen at the time is that while military action is coming closer and closer to the city of Energodar, I mean, when the Ukrainian troops are approaching, there'll be no way to minimize those consequences of a nuclear accident. And because of that, there may be terrible scale consequences of that explosion. So we cannot even foresee what's going to happen. So my call is to the government of Ukraine. President Zelensky made a statement the day before yesterday about Russians actually preparing an explosion at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So my call as someone who was a part of negotiations with G7 about closing nuclear power plant in Chernobyl back in 2000, I am entitled to speaking to the leaders of the world's leading nations, and I'm calling them to stop this mad dictator Putin when he was threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons. He actually was told to stop. And so now they need to do this again if the leaders of world's major states have to articulate and make a warning to him. It is inadmissible in 21st century to make nuclear strikes, not only with missiles and nuclear warheads, but also with blowing up nuclear power plants, because this is a threat that may lead to a nuclear war of the world scale. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Юрій. Абсолютно. One of the problems is that the entire situation is being viewed simply as an act of war. Тобто воно применшується, it is being minimized as, well, there's a war going on, what can you expect? I mean, etc. And it is not being properly categorized or broadcast as a genuine threat, or as Volodymyr Zelensky said, a potential terrorist act. In fact, some of the reaction in the West in the media has been a kind of a light, well, that's a little bit of an overreaction. I mean, come on, we know there's a war going on. So that is an issue that we are having here, is making people understand that this is not like blowing up a bridge. This is not simply an act of war. This is on a worldwide scale, and anything that happens at the power plant will not affect only Ukraine, but will have worldwide implications. That said, Pane Yuri, what can we do, or what do you suggest, or what can we do in the West to reclassify this or put it in the condition of, frankly, a worldwide terrorist act and not merely an act of war?
I think the best answer to this threat would be to, first of all, make people realize, make people aware that the world is facing such a huge catastrophe, on a threshold of a huge nuclear catastrophe. And if it happens, it may become a trigger for further nuclear war scenario. The war in Ukraine, Russian aggression may evolve into a nuclear scenario. They may start with that explosion at a nuclear power plant, and it may end, God forbid, but it may end with a thermonuclear war. Some people don't understand this, unfortunately. Many people don't realize this threat, and unfortunately, even political leaders seem to fail to understand that, even though they should be able to understand and put efforts in order to prevent this scenario to be implemented, no matter how crazy Putin is. Thank you. We will go back later to questions from our listeners.
Right now, we are going to, thank you, Dr. Kostenko. We're going to go back to specifically the relationship between the actual or parallels between the Chernobyl event and the explosion and destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. And to that, we turn to Olis Kuzma, who has decades of experience of dealing with actually the Chernobyl crisis. Olisu?
Thank you, Irene. And I wanted to thank Nadia McConnell and the people at the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for this opportunity to share this. I think it's really important to look at the parallels and non-parallels, what we can learn from the Chernobyl disaster, but also I think in every man-made disaster, there's also a tendency to sort of fight the old war. There's that old adage that generals always prepare for the previous war, and the same thing happens that very often humanitarian aid organizations tend to prepare for disasters that came before, and they may be applicable and may not be applicable. Dr. Kostenko's very grim but important assessment, I think, is important because I recall that during the 9/11, I think it's important for us as Americans to grasp the potential parallels between this disaster and those that we're familiar with, whether it's Hurricane Katrina or 9/11. Ukraine is already suffering a daily dose of 9/11. We remember how traumatized we were as Americans with just one day of hellish terrorist bombings. If some of the viewers may remember that there was some speculation that the 9/11 terrorists were considering an attack not on the World Trade Center, as symbolic and spectacular as that disaster was, but also looking at the possibility of flying the planes into the Indian Point nuclear station, which is about 20 miles north of New York on the Hudson River, and what that could have portended for America. Many nuclear experts assured us that that would not be a big problem because the containment pressure vessels, the containment buildings around those reactors were so secure that even if a large airliner had crashed into them, it would not have affected the situation internally. And we're getting similar assurances now from people in the nuclear industry that, well, don't worry. First of all, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is much more secure. We've learned from Chernobyl. There've been and it's true that the graphite cooled reactors at Chernobyl were far more unstable and far more dangerous than Zaporizhzhia was. The other factor that again, to provide a little bit of assurance, is that post Fukushima, during the Chernobyl disaster, there was a lot of speculation that, well, these kinds of disasters could never happen in the United States or in Western Europe because the Soviets were incompetent and reckless in the way that they handled their nuclear industry. Well, Fukushima was built on much more solid international standards with many more containment provisions and safeguards. And yet that tsunami took the world community and the nuclear industry by surprise. That did lead to a major radiation release. Post Fukushima, we've had a lot of additional stress tests and other safety procedures that were adopted. But we're really looking at a very different situation. This is where the parallels between Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia begin to falter, and actually not to the benefit of humanity, but to its greater detriment. And when we think of Chernobyl, that as incompetent and delusional as the Soviet authorities were in responding to that accident, basically everybody was pulling in the same direction. Everybody, the Soviets, even though they were in denial about the impact, everybody was trying desperately to seal up the reactor, to stop the release of radiation, and to prevent the seepage of radiation into the headwaters of the Dnipro River, to prevent massive contamination downstream. We're assuming that the Russians, I think Westerners are assuming that the Russians have a stake in keeping the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant safe. And that's the assumption that was made by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Well, you guys don't really want to blow this thing up, do you? But what if Putin and his psychotic warlords have already decided that they have a different agenda? Maybe they have a different scorched earth policy, or a different flood earth policy in this case, which they clearly have shown a proclivity to promote. And what if they've convinced themselves that they actually have something to gain from the destruction of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant? Far-fetched? Not really, because if you think about their attitude, already they've shown not just callous disregard, but grotesque recklessness, even again, in the way that they handled the more recent near Chernobyl disaster, where the Russian occupation forces, during their invasion trying to attack Kyiv, occupied the Chernobyl nuclear plant again. And if you remember what happened then, they had a lot of their troops actually camping out in the fields, totally disregarding the radiation health risks in the Red Forest and the heavily contaminated, permanently contaminated areas around Chernobyl. So clearly they've shown that they don't even care if their own soldiers are irradiated, whether by Chernobyl or by Zaporizhia. And so, you know, if they've already shown that they can be shamelessly reckless in this way. And we really have not factored in what Dr. Kostenko raised, which is that if the Russians decide that they want to destroy, either in whole or in part, try to destroy one of the Zaporizhia sites, or even if they wanted to do a controlled release of radiation from some of the spent fuel rod pools on site, that could also be incredibly disastrous. And we can only foresee a certain amount of the potential of what these disasters, what this kind of a disaster can lead to. And, you know, when we think of people like Putin and Prigozhin and Medvedev and Solovyov and all of the, you know, Putin's mouthpieces that have openly been calling for nuclear war, have been openly calling for, you know, a radiation disaster to be inflicted on Ukraine, it doesn't take a huge leap of faith to see just how catastrophic this can be. I mean, these are, we think of Putin because he puts on a suit and tie, that he's, you know, still kind of a reasonable person, a reasonable statesman. I mean, really, when you think of Putin, you have to think of somebody, and I used to represent, as a lawyer, I used to represent convicted criminals in habeas corpus proceedings. But this guy is like Charles Manson. I mean, he's a sadistic, psychotic freak who enjoys inflicting massive suffering on other people. And so if we're looking at the psychology of these monsters that have inflicted unspeakable harm on Ukraine as part of this war, it's not inconceivable that they could come up with a creative solution to their own defeats by trying to impose this horrific disaster, compounded disaster. I just wanted to shift briefly to why years ago, I actually went on a environmental cruise down the Dnipro River with a group of Western environmentalists. And I remember going through the locks on the Nova Kakhovka Dam and continuing downstream to Odessa. And I mean, it's something for us in the West to appreciate, is the fact that this is, as Tim pointed out, this is an incredibly fertile, agriculturally rich region. It's not quite semi-tropical, but I think the analogy with the Central California, the areas of California that we identify as like some of the richest agricultural land. I mean, this area of Kherson and the surrounding region provides, unbelievable riches, everything from watermelons, wheat, corn, tomatoes, some of the most succulent tomatoes you'll ever eat in your life, you will find in Kherson. And for me, just on a personal level, it is very heartbreaking, because years ago, working with the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund, we had a partner hospital in Kherson where we were setting up a neonatal intensive care unit. And on multiple levels, that is incredibly tragic, because you think of these preemie babies that these doctors in Kherson were able to save back in 2001, 2002, 2003. Some of these babies are probably on the front lines right now, fighting in on the Eastern Front and fighting in Zaporizhia. And the other thing that I agree with Tim, that with Dr. Flanagan, that we really have to look at access to healthcare, that this is a a multiplicity of disasters that are piled on from a public health standpoint, so that we're seeing, the real danger that ensues from, already we've seen the Russians have destroyed, on last count, 114, completely destroyed 114 hospitals. And there are over 1,000 hospitals and clinics in Ukraine that have been damaged significantly. So for the Russians, destroying medical infrastructure is nothing. It's just like destroying electrical infrastructure and hoping that, thousands of Ukrainians freeze to death last winter. Thank God that didn't happen because of the immense creativity of the Ukrainian people. But it is incredibly tragic. And I visited. We actually had friends in the town of Oleshki, which was one of the most heavily flooded areas, with just beautiful people in this area. I mean, they were the local people were helping with an orphanage. They had a tuberculosis hospital for kids there. I'm assuming that whole area has been wiped out. And Oleshki was a very promising area. So there are these human tragedies that all boil down to individual families and people that have suffered tremendously. I know we want to get into a broader discussion of this, so I don't want to overextend my short statement here. But I did want to say that it's very important in every public health disaster like this. Although I'm not a public health expert like Tim and Dr. Mamotenko, but we learned the hard way through the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund that sometimes the health effects you most expect are not the most significant, and then public health effects that you don't expect tend to be more prominent and more devastating. And just as one little example of this, where there was a certain level of public health hubris on the part of some of the people in the World Health Organization and the IAEA that came to Ukraine and Belarus back in the early 1900s. The IAEA actually, I think at that time, performed abysmally and cynically and in a very morally depraved way, which is basically that they felt that their role was to minimize the public the perception of a public health disaster, and to basically convince the world community that Ukrainians and Belarusians, they're overreacting. The only real problem here that we see in Ukraine and Belarus is a new disease called radiophobia. People are terrified of radiation, irrationally. People in Ukraine and Belarus were telling the IAEA, and our foundation was seeing dramatic cases of thyroid cancer. 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 6-year-old children with giant tumors on their necks. And Dr. Zenon Matkivsky, who was the president of our foundation, confronted the IAEA on this issue and saying, look, you guys aren't even looking in the right places. You should be looking downwind from the nuclear site as to where the most likely cases of thyroid cancer would occur. The reaction from the IAEA at that time was that, well, we remember after Hiroshima, there weren't many cases of thyroid cancer, so that should not be a major issue. Again, you're just overreacting, or you're not seeing what you're seeing. People didn't realize that in Japan, one reason why there was not a big surge in thyroid cancer was that the Japanese diet heavily depends on seafood and naturally occurring iodine, which acts as a blocking agent on the thyroid gland. And so that's, again, people didn't think far enough ahead to figure out that, what happened in Japan may not be happening in Ukraine. And so eventually the IAEA was caught with its pants down, if you'll forgive the rather sordid image, when in 1994 in Nature magazine, there was a report that finally tracked the levels of thyroid cancer in Belarus and Ukraine. And lo and behold, found that the rates of thyroid cancer were 80 times, not 80%, 80 times higher than normal in downwind communities in Belarus, in Mogilev, in Gomel, in Chernihiv, et cetera. And this would not have been hard for the IAEA and international research agencies to find, had they wanted to look for it. And then after that, finally, the IAEA admitted, oh yeah, I guess you kind of did catch us with, unawares. So we'll grant you that there was thyroid cancer, and it was a real epidemic. It actually grew to 100 times higher than normal in subsequent reports in the WHO. But then they say, but that's it, right? It's got to be nothing but thyroid cancer and nothing but radiophobia. So they didn't look at birth defects. They didn't look at premature babies. They didn't look at the impact on women in prenatal situations. And so the world will never know ultimately what the total impact of Chernobyl was, because the world looked the other way. So that's a mistake we can't make now. That's something we have to learn from. And I think Dr. Flanagan is right that we have to look very holistically at this whole disaster. And then finally to think realistically, how can we respond to this in a way that's there's always an element of humanitarian triage in this kind of a disaster. You can't save everybody. So you have to think, with limited resources, and especially in a wartime situation, how many people can you save with resources invested? In our case, we ended up doing a major shift from trying to combat leukemia, which was the anticipated.
Okay, Alicia, I'm going to
Oh, sorry.
actually, okay.
And then
No,
we
love you.
shifted.
I mean, but you led into, thank you.
Yeah.
You led into sort of really the motivation for this webinar, which is, given what Dr. Kostenko has said about the genuine, unrecognized threat of what can happen at the Zaporizhzhia power plant and the consequences of a radiation-based accident that we have all reasons to believe is not going to be ignored by the Kremlin. I mean, why not? As everybody has mentioned, they're willing to destroy everything else. Even a small controlled accident, given what Doctors Flanagan and Mamotenko have said about the public health consequences. Why is it that just like Chernobyl was mitigated by the IAEA, why is this disaster being, this is a question actually to all of you, and we can get into the Q&As, and anybody who is listening now, please use if you have any questions, please use the QA button and type it in. But we'll start off this Q&A session with the questions. Why are these issues, why is this being mitigated again? Why are these issues not being addressed? Because this is not just an issue for Ukraine. This really has international implications. I mean, the food shortages in the next 4 or 5 years in Africa and Asia are going to be a direct result of the fact that the 5th largest grain producing country in the world is currently, that land is being destroyed and not being planted. What's going on? Why are people not paying attention and focusing on this, and out of their own self-interest even? And I turn to every one of you, please, if you have an answer or a speculation. Okay, Nadia. All right, Nadia, go ahead. And then I'd like to get to everybody as well, because this is, and what can we do? Because this is really, for those of us who lived through 86, it's creepy actually. It's kind of like, wow, been there, done that. I mean, everybody's kind of, yeah. And then for millions and millions of people, literally millions of people suffered for decades. And there was no recognition or understanding, and not even a willingness to learn from it. I mean, we didn't even do any longitudinal studies from Chernobyl. Forget aid. So, okay, Naju, please.
Yeah, we have seen major international organizations always looking at Ukraine through the lens of Moscow. And I had maybe naively hoped that with this latest aggression by Russia, that perhaps it would penetrate that. But look, we had the International Red Cross open up their humanitarian office in Russia. And actually, Yuri wrote a year ago, or he said in an interview, the IAEA is lying when it says that there are no problems at Ukraine's nuclear power plants, because IAEA is itself under Russian influence. Maybe Yuri, you should pick up on that. You said this a year ago.
This is not only about IAEA. But unfortunately, this is the problem of the majority of international organizations, which one way or another are impacted by Russian corruption. In 1997, I was nominated by Ukraine for the position of Secretary General of IAEA. This was a big issue. The Chernobyl plant was a topical issue, and most countries were looking at this positively. But Russia was one exception. For Russia, my candidacy was totally unacceptable, and they used their influences, and my candidacy was rejected. Unfortunately, the US did not support my candidacy either. But as a candidate for that position, and I represented Ukraine in IAEA, I knew pretty well the structure and how decisions are made in IAEA and who out of the major countries, how they impact those decisions. It is understandable that from a formal standpoint, the biggest investors of both IAEA and with the biggest capabilities were in the hands of US and Russia, as well as there's a successor of the Soviet Union. But in terms of corrupt influences in this agency, of course, Russia was the only one to do that. Why and how? Russia controls many countries which are members of IAEA, but they don't have a developed nuclear power system, and they have little understanding of nuclear security issues, especially such countries as those in Africa, in Asia. But those are the countries and their representatives in IAEA were most supportive of Russian position traditionally. So my conclusion is unequivocal. What IAEA is saying now in regard to Russia's capturing the Chernobyl plant, and the first statement from Director General Grossi after they seized Zaporizhia plant. This did not even mention international terrorism on behalf of Russia. He just said that the radiation level near Chernobyl is within normal level. His other absurd statement was when he spoke last May, when he said that Zaporizhia plant, at the Zaporizhia plant, they found 30 tons of plutonium and 40 tons of uranium. This is absurd because it's IAEA that guarantees to the world that peaceful nuclear programs are not used for military purposes. It is the inspectors of IAEA that carry out monitoring and are supposed to watch what happens at those power plants by the hour. So without their control, not a single kilo of used plutonium or other fuel cannot be moved because they have seals on those storage facilities. Without the presence of international inspectors, nothing can happen there. People don't understand these details, but those who do, especially experts in the United States, for some reason failed to notice and react to this absurd behavior of the IAEA Secretary General. Unfortunately, so I had to make that statement of mine, and I said that IAEA is doing cover-up for Russian crimes in terrorism that they're carrying out. The peak of that cynicism of IAEA Director General was the statement a few days ago that the cooling pond in Zaporizhzhia plant will provide normal cooling at least for the next 2 months. And therefore, this threat is not really formidable. But the fact that IAEA inspectors were not admitted to those locations by the Russian military to see where they planted the mines, the explosives at the power plant, where exactly those explosives are. They were not allowed to see the storage facilities for used fuel where they have put their weapons. They were not allowed to see the turbine spaces where, according to our staff reports, they did plant explosives there of the plant itself. All those things, for some reason, Mr. Grossi did not even mention, but his claims about the safety zone around Zaporizhzhia plant, he just copy-pasted what the principles of safe nuclear energy say, and those are commonly known things to anyone. So my conclusion is that IAEA, due to the fact that Russia controls who becomes the Director General, and you know, Mr. Grossi was re-elected for the second term recently. Russia uses this agency only to cover up their nuclear terrorism, but not in order to let this agency prevent a tragedy that may happen if a tragedy that is very likely to happen there. Thank you, Mr. Yuri. This is hard to hear, but we have to get this heard. You're totally right. We, as we say, we intuitively feel this, and when we read articles in the social media, the messages are, don't worry, everything's fine. Russia is interested in keeping things safe and things like that, you know. We have a question.
We have a question now to Dr. Flanagan and Mamotenko. In terms of international organizations, do you know of what work or what interest or what impact is the World Health Organization doing after the Kakhovka dam? What is their position? And the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Fund since 2022 has collected $2.2 billion specifically for humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And how is that being used, or any of it being used, either currently or in the public health sphere? Those two international organizations in particular.
Sure. The WHO has already noted that issues of cholera and contaminated water supplies are huge, and that this is a grave concern. I think they aren't looking at the scope of the humanitarian disaster, but they're focusing on the problems of clean water, which is good and appropriate. WHO can alert countries to the scope of this, but they're not primarily a relief organization. I cannot comment on the UN humanitarian aid funding and where those dollars go or how they go. I just don't have information on that. Others may know that. Maybe Alex, you might comment on that.
Sadly, I can't. I really don't know, the scope of what the UN humanitarian organization can do. My hunch is that a lot of smaller NGOs are providing the direct aid into this area, but I don't know if they can scale up fast enough to really respond without a more comprehensive analysis of what needs to happen.
The general reaction of the government of Ukraine and officials is that there's a disconnect, that the large international organizations are not nimble enough, fast enough to respond. They can do massive, when there's a natural disaster and you need massive food dumps, that can be managed, ship, a cargo of foodstuffs or of medical supplies, but that they are not unable to respond to such a broad in terms of geographical disaster and one that is so multi-layered. I mean,
But Anna, if I might add though, but also they are limited. They will only go so a certain distance from the front lines. That is, so that's why the local smaller NGOs are so critical, because they're delivering things, you know, to the
right
front.
into the front, yes, into the
Yeah,
front
and the
lines.
same issue is in the demining. The huge organizations have gotten millions of dollars, and yet they haven't demined anything. But it's these smaller efforts that are working, and part of it is this policy about how close can they get to the front lines.
Another question to doctors, and then we're going to have to end after that because we are really reaching our limit, but to Doctors Flanagan and Mamotenko. So given that clean water is essential and that it is currently not really, or for long, not going to be available, what are some possible solutions? Is it resettlement? Are there temporary kind of solutions of water supply that can be above ground instituted? What do you foresee as some possible solutions for this region?
Right. Well, you don't want to depopulate. These are thriving communities, and that's critically important. Certainly individuals that are more marginalized or vulnerable, they're very young, they're very old, they need extra care and may be able to move back. But in terms of clean water or being able to safely provide water, you can provide, for example, coordinated strategies that can be used to allow communities and households to operate. It's under great hardship and great sacrifice and great suffering, but distributing chlorinated tablets or being able to distribute strategies so that folks can utilize water safely is really important, because you have to begin to normalize life. And that's not only for the body, it's also for the mind, it's also for the community. You know, we have to be able to be together and share together for our hearts, our souls, our minds, and our bodies.
Thank you. There's one other, just a comment, it's not a question, I'll share it, that we received, and that is that Ukraine has been the victim of human-caused catastrophes, 2 major human-caused catastrophes. These are not naturally caused catastrophes. This is not a flood because of a tsunami. This is not a hurricane, even though that's coming because of climate change, and that is human caused. But that is something that seems the world not to understand or doesn't seem to matter. Does it matter? Is there a difference between a human caused catastrophe and a naturally caused environmental catastrophe? And if so, just your reactions or comments to that.
Yes, it's a scope of evil, which is on another level, that to purposefully cause such incredible suffering and destruction is so wrong. And at the end of the day, we are humanity and humankind, mankind, we are one and need to help each other. And this is the exact opposite. So we have to call it what it is. The truth is important.
Okay, well, I can't even think of a better phrase to end this on. Thank you, Dr. Flanagan. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for all of our guests that have joined us today. Once again, this will be available for viewing and for listening. And U.S. Ukraine Foundation, thank you for organizing this, and we hope that you will organize another panel on this topic. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.